All right.
Yeah?
Should we get started?
Let's.
Yeah?
Yep.
Okay. Thank you guys for coming. And thank you, Matt, for coming.
Sorry to interrupt. Should I close this as well?
I can close that.
Okay.
And thank you to Københavns Kunstskole for making this artist talk possible. We're going to do like an artist talk with Matt for about an hour or so, and then have a bit of a sort of like a discussion and open it up to questions from there. I'll give a short introduction of Matt Siegle. Matt Siegle is a Los Angeles-based artist. He has exhibited throughout the United States and Europe. In September, he will exhibit at Liste Art Fair Basel with Good Weather from Chicago. Exhibitions and performances previously include Good Weather, The Luminary in St. Louis, Years Copenhagen, Park View in Los Angeles, Nada, Miami Beach, Sunday in London, Artist Space, New York, Anthony Greeny, Boston, the Getty Pacific Standard Time in Los Angeles, and numerous other places. And as I mentioned, Matt was exhibiting with Good Weather at this year's Liste in Basel, just a couple of weeks ago. Matt Siegle received his MFA from the California Institute of the Arts in 2009 and currently teaches sculpture at Dartmouth College in
Hanover, New Hampshire.
All right. But welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thank you, Rasmus, for inviting me. And thank you to the school for hosting my talk. I appreciate you all coming out. And sorry about the reschedule, but, well, here we are. So I have quite a lot of material to go through, and I would like to ask that people don't ask questions while I'm speaking, so we can just get through it all. Unless you have a really hard time hearing me or you don't understand a particular word. So questions about the work at large, maybe let's leave those to the side for now. Okay. So I'm an interdisciplinary artist. Mostly identify as a sculptor, but that said, I kind of sort of resist these ideas of a single discipline artist, and I work kind of counter to many of the sort of dominant trends in sculptural discourse. Just as a brief overview, I'm largely interested in the kind of the interrelationship between humans and the land, and how art can be a mediator for this discussion. And then more specifically, I'm curious to look at that as it relates to different identity groups that have maybe been left out of this discussion in the long run. So in my case, that happens to be the LGBTQ identity group. I identify as a queer man, and so, in other words, how you can kind of queer landscape art. I kind of found my way into objects, into sculpture through performance. So I'm going to start by showing you very quickly just a couple of performance projects that is where the objects started to bubble up. And again, I don't want to go too much into the content of these because that's somewhat divergent from talking about the sculptures that have come up later, but it's where they started. So this is a project called the Cassidy Project. It's a long-form durational performance that led to a large body of work, performances, videos, photography. A lot of it has not been exhibited. And in this project, I was embodying a persona that I called Cassidy, who was this kind of countercultural wannabe. There's this like representation of an attitude of apathy that derived from people's fetishization of counterculture between the 1960s and 1990s, the sort of piling up of signifiers of tie-dye and Kurt Cobain and grunge rock and protest, casual drug usage, that sort of thing. So this is a medical marijuana ID card that you used to have to get in California, and I took a picture in this long-form performance in this suit with my hair sort of mocking the cover of Kurt Cobain on Rolling Stone magazine. But I bring this into the discussion because this, to me, is more of an object than it is really a photograph or a performance per se, yet it was coming out of this performance. So these objects, I didn't think of myself as a sculptor, but they kind of were just sort of bubbling up in the performances themselves. This is Ice Cream Cone Kid. It's a fairly famous Grateful Dead icon. And so as another example of just this piling of signifiers of counterculture on top of each other, I recreated that that persona as this Cassidy character. This project also sort of started to overlap with my understanding, or kind of my lack of understanding of queer history and identity. So one video from this performance is me like throwing around these Cheetos in the air and eating them inside of the AIDS Memorial Grove in Golden Gate Park. I can't imagine doing something like this now, but at the time it was felt like it sort of articulated a misunderstanding that I had, but also a misunderstanding that I saw in the world at large. So just to kind of emblemize or sort of distill the attitude of this project, I often refer to this poem or song called Rockstar by Hole, which is Courtney Love. And just a little chunk of lyrics from that goes a little something like, well, I went to school in Olympia, everyone's the same. What do you do with a revolution? Well, I went to school in Olympia, and everyone's the same. And so are you in Olympia, yeah. Everyone's the same. We look the same, we talk the same, we even fuck the same. So in 2014, I did another long-form performance called the Human Potential Movement, which I did here at Years, and then also again in Los Angeles. And this performance was looking back more towards the countercultures of the Transcendentalists, so in the 19th century. And these two performances actually are a good introduction because they largely identify my interest in counterculture and then that as it relates to the Western landscape. So without going too deeply into the content of this performance, it largely worked with a collage of texts from the Esalen Institute in Big Sur, which is a famous 1960s sort of center for New Age thinking. It also worked with texts from Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman, some meditation texts, some entries from my own journal. And in this performance, I was kind of repeating these actions of lighting a candle and then snuffing it out while my computer interfaced with the internet and was playing a kind of collage of these texts back. But again, objects were sort of becoming actors in these performances in a way that was kind of taking autonomy, like the card for the medical marijuana treatment center. But they really weren't discrete sculptures yet, per se, in that, pulling them out of this context, they could maybe be considered ephemera or props, but, maybe not fully sculptures in their own right. That said, I'm kind of interested in that gray area, but I still wasn't quite in the place where I was articulating objects just as the kind of concentration of the idea that I was working on. So just to quickly read a small poem by Walt Whitman from Leaves of Grass. This is called For You, O Democracy. Come, I will make the continent indissoluble. I will make the most splendid race the sun has ever shone upon. I will make divine magnetic lands with the love of comrades, with the lifelong love of comrades. I will plant companionship thick as trees along all the rivers of America, and along the shores of the Great Lakes and over the prairies. I will make inseparable cities with their arms about each other's necks by the love of comrades, by the manly love of comrades. For you, these for me, O democracy, to serve you, my femme. For you, I am trilling these songs. So I'm lighting the candle here, and then I would just snuff it out with my fingers. Here we are at Years, and right here in Copenhagen. And in this performance, I was largely interested in, beyond the text, in posture, thinking about my body and the gestures that my body made, and the posture that the body held as a vehicle and a sort of sculpture itself to triangulate the content that I was relaying through the performance. And I think why I bring this up is that with my sculptures now, I often make these in relationship to thinking about a body, and thinking about the gestures of a body, or the posture of a body, or the relationship of objects to a body. So here you can see some of these objects that sort of, were kind of clustered around me. Things like the chords and the speakers and the phone, it's all very, very intentional. The modem. So again, every night that I did this performance, this pile of matches would get larger and larger. Yet at the same time, you couldn't really take those matches out and have them have the meaning of an autonomous sculpture without the knowledge that they came from this, this kind of ritualistic performance. So this object here is, I think, one of the first examples of an object that I created as part of a different performance that really was actually, the scales had tipped, and this was more of an autonomous object rather than a prop for the actual actions that I was engaging in. This is, I don't know if you're familiar with this in Denmark, but pirate's booty is a kind of health food, junk food in the United States. And this is actually a painting on grocery bags. It's quite large, about 4 feet by 3 feet. And I'm not sure what that is in centimeters, so I apologize. But the bag in the performance held things, so I was using it to grab objects out that I had made and then was giving those objects away. But the bag itself, as a painting, as an object, I think now really stands on its own as a, well, it's an autonomous object. The idea gets across without, the knowledge necessarily that I performed with it. So I'm going to move away from the performance here a little bit. Just that's kind of the groundwork for where I got to and where I'm working now. Basically, the performance that I was doing became more and more about language, and that sort of eventually dissolved into poetry. And then at the same time, my personal interests were becoming more focused on this idea of the Western American utopia and humans' relationship with the land, whereas prior it was more about counterculture and about, the spirit within that counterculture. I was now turning towards more the direct relationship of humans and Earth, and for a long time I was very kind of driven by this question of what is natural. I was becoming more increasingly concerned with environmental issues during this time. And so following the, researching into 19th century countercultures with the Transcendentalists and Walt Whitman, I kind of triangulated that with my interest in the Western landscape and began to consider what was really, by some, the last American frontier, which was the Yukon Gold Rush up in Alaska. Some of those communities are still actually alive as frontier gold rush communities. But I was interested in looking back towards history. So when I started my research, I was looking at a lot of photographs and objects of miners in the Yukon during the 19th century. So I have a few that I can flip through here. Very, very provisional structures and hard living. And at the same time, I learned that just outside of Los Angeles, there's the East Fork of the San Gabriel River, which is, if you're not familiar with Los Angeles, there's these large mountains outside of the city, and there is some water, believe it or not. And the East Fork of the San Gabriel River runs through the mountains and was actually subject to a gold rush in the 1930s. And it was developed for that to be mined kind of in the late 30s. And then that eventually went away because of flash floods. So there's no development there anymore. You can only hike in by foot. So I was looking at this in, I guess it was maybe around 2015, and there, because of the economic collapse in 2009 in LA, there was quite a large population of people who were sort of drifting or living in their vans or, sort of not necessarily totally unhoused or what some might call homeless people, but, just in between, if you will. And there was a whole community of people that were living up in this canyon to mine this stream for gold. They were kind of some of them were sort of historical fetishists, and others were actually doing it as a means for economy. And so I got really interested in this site and started spending a lot of time up there. So it's really beautiful and also can be quite rugged. And I started, documenting some of these people and what they were doing up in this canyon, and wanted to make some work that was working off of that site and that narrative. But I wasn't trying to be a documentarian because I didn't believe that that was my role with artwork. So these are historical pictures here from the 1930s. And then this is someone's tent who lives up in that canyon right now and mines the river for gold. So there's, as I was exploring that, I mostly was interested in the narrative of these people and this kind of fantasy that I had about some of the people who were living in the canyon. But all these objects that they were making there were really these kind of tertiary things that were they used in their mining, but they also had this very strange quality to them that really stuck with me, of a kind of essential materialness and a real rugged functionality that I found very appealing. So this is a sled that if someone was digging out a trench to have water go into, you would put the dirt from this and then you could drag it behind you. But it's I believe it's like a 50-gallon drum or something like that, cut in half. So that car that I showed you at the beginning, the truck, that's a miner who lives up in the canyon. And in the back of his truck, you can see there are lots of other things that relate to his operations up there, and then also some trash. So again, there's this real gray area between what is a functional object and what is garbage. Over here on the left, my mouse does, oh yeah, it does do that. This is an object that you would call a sluice box, and that's a way to sort larger rocks from smaller rocks if you're digging out and trying to refine the material that you're looking for gold in. So again, there are people that actually are living up in this canyon, and you know, it's some people are choosing to do it by will and some not. It's a kind of unusual situation. So I made some paintings about this. That was my primary interest, actually, was to work on paintings. And I'll show you just 3 of these real quickly. They, again, they don't really work with the figures themselves because I wasn't interested in documenting that sort of, you know, like personal narrative. I was more interested in my kind of fantasy axis opening up. So the titles are sort of where I get to that with the work, and I'll read you at least the title for this. They're quite long. Pretend to be of the land, crouch lower, take a closer look, nestle an index finger in the crook of the sun-baked base plate and the metal rod, sliding along the steel upright so rigid it could break your face. Slowly now. With a flip of the finger, the hand truck quivers, then falls, clanging on rocks. A small cloud of dust. The dust settles in silt. The silt tickles your nose. Inhale deep, through each sinus, grit on your nostrils. Now tasting the earth, ringing metallic. Maybe it's gold, but Eddie says more likely your own nostalgia. So this is an acrylic painting on, again, on grocery bags. It's 34 by 22 inches. A double version of that painting. I oftentimes repeat things to kind of signify a break in the reality of a narrative. Again, a doubled object, in this case a tent. So this is also the first time I started actually showing sculptures. They came around as a kind of offset of the painting work. You know, I had found these things up in the canyon that were interesting to me, like I mentioned to you, showed you with that sled. And some of these objects I picked up and brought back with me. And I thought to myself, I was like, well, why not work with some of these things? I kind of backed up into it almost. So this is called Arroyo Seco bedding spoon, and it's found sleeping material. It's 44 inches by 32 inches. So back to you know, what I showed you in the back of that person's truck before, the sluice box. This is a sculpture that I made called Sluice Box from 2015. And again, you know, working with my fictional narrative, this is a milk crate with found sex tissues from the site up in the canyon. It's kind of a mixed-use area, and sometimes people go up there and party. And there was a spot where 2 people had obviously gone and had sex. And I collected those tissues and then put it inside the milk crate as a kind of makeshift sluice box. I also made a tent sculpture for this show that again was somewhat accidental, but I showed it and it really kind of took on this life in a way that I didn't really understand the sculpture myself, but people who were viewing it, it was the strangest thing. They were almost instructing me as to why I should be looking at the work. This is a different tent sculpture. I have a better photo that shows the overall view of this. So it's from a little bit later than that last show that I was just showing a few images from. This is called New Model Ray Lakes Domicile from 2016, and the materials are fiberglass and aluminum, acrylic on Tyvek with grommets, paracord, found wood, and metal. So while I was working on this East Fork project, I happened to be working at this museum in Los Angeles called the Autry Museum of the American West as a collections specialist. And so I was working in the museum's large storage area, handling their entire collection, which is mostly object-based all day. And I had been spending a lot of time in the San Gabriel Canyon, and I didn't want to do that anymore. It was too dark, too psychologically dark for me. So I, was looking at these objects in the museum and had wanted to get out of the canyon. I, made a lot more work about it than I just showed you there. And one day, as I was in the museum, I came across this archive of queer rodeo material, which seemingly hadn't really been touched in years. And that was this funny moment that really I began to pivot towards looking more at traditional kind of Western archetypes as a space for queer conversation that hadn't really happened so much. I didn't really believe that it could happen in this really traditionally male, sort of macho, super overdetermined genre. And so discovering this archive and it just allowed me to kind of begin to understand, like, well, maybe I can actually, find some space for conversation in here that hasn't been done already. And it also, if you're looking at, notions of the West from a queer perspective, there's just loads of problems that you can take down. So there's a lot of material to work with. The kind of idea of white male salvation with the indigenous people as savages, and the idea of enlightenment and progress and what have you. So this is a still from John, The Searchers in 1956 with John Wayne. So just to show a few art historical examples of the way that the West has been portrayed perhaps problematically, or most certainly problematically. This is a painting from 1872 by John Gast called American Progress. And you can see here there's, like Lady Enlightenment coming forward, bringing the light to the savages who are in clouds and darkness. It's a really terribly offensive painting. But these ideas somehow with Western artwork just don't go away and get stuck coming through even to this day. So this is a painting called Warriors by Martin Grell from 1996. And then this is a picture from the Masters of the American West exhibition in 2021, where again, they're still just carrying on this romantic depiction of the Western United States. So just to kind of keep it towards sculpture, these are two sculptures from the Met, Frederick Remington, the Bronco Buster, and James Earl Fraser, The End of the Trail. Bronze is a very traditional material for Western-based sculptures. And here we have two, again, stereotypical, arguably somewhat racist in the case of James Earl Fraser's sculpture, and they're in the Met Museum. We can revisit those later during discussion. So to be just a little bit more specific about what I mean when I'm talking about the West in terms of the United States, the red line here is the Mississippi River. And as it was considered during the 19th century, crossing the Mississippi River was the beginning point for all the settling migratory pathways. So in my research, the Mississippi River is always the easternmost frontier of what people would consider to be the West, so to speak. So I began to explore this landscape on my own, following some of these migratory pathways, whether they were, settler pathways, so to speak, like the Pony Express Trail, or older trading routes that were established by indigenous people. This here is the Santa Fe Trail. It doesn't show up super well, but it runs all the way from the Mississippi River in St. Louis to northwestern New Mexico. And so I was traveling following the Santa Fe Trail, following the Pony Express in my car, and stopping at various stopping points along the way and collecting objects. So I began to develop what I thought of as these kind of alternative monuments for these migratory pathways and the different points on them. This is a spot in Nevada on the Pony Express Trail, and it's an abandoned motel, and from the back of it, you can see down here in the corner, there's this little orange blob, and I was exploring the site and found that orange blob, and it stuck to me and became a sculpture. And so this is RO number 64, Shell Creek, Lenny Bruce from 2017. It's found dried paint, acrylic on Tyvek, and hollow core door. Again, I made a bunch of these. I'm just showing a few here just to kind of keep moving along. But I was, collecting these found objects and altering them slightly or presenting them as these sort of alternative monuments for a kind of newer understanding of, what some might consider to be trash. This is RO 68. It's a Prairie Gate Enola Gay from 2017. So materials are found: microwave, Starbucks double shot energy can, vertebra and bucket, LED organic grocery bag, accessory cord, recycled denim insulation, and acrylic paint on wood. This is a smaller sculpture, RO number 17, Woodford's MGDD from 2019. And it's a found can and object and then acrylic paint on steel. So my traveling through the landscape and my research at the museum as well led to all the sculpture and painting in a show I had in 2019 called Come On Done Horse. This is also when I started working with bronze, which is, as I mentioned before, is historically a kind of cliched Western idea of a material. The overall exhibition here, I'm not going to talk about the paintings because, again, I'm trying to keep it object-oriented, but with the objects itself, it was basically there were 4 wall-based sculptures and then 2 floor-based sculptures. And the wall-based sculptures were set up as a kind of a compass, but it was set askew by 22 degrees. So a kind of queering of an idea of a standard compass at cardinal points of north, south, east, west. I took that and just shifted it. So quickly I will just flip through some installation shots here. If you go back to this, these are the two points of the compass, and then as you rotate to the left, you're in this one room, and then if you keep rotating to the left, there's a third point of the compass, and if you keep rotating, that's the 4th right there. And then just to be in that other room quickly, looking back towards the room that I showed you first, and then the 2 other compass points. This show, I also began to explore working with water as a material source, both for kind of the traditional sculptural reasons of making fountains, but also because water determines the way that people move across a landscape, largely, and it's also the material that shapes the land. So this here is a fountain sculpture that I won't talk too much about in this lecture overall, but it just, it is a thematic that comes up again and again for me. This is a sculpture in the show that I called the Odyssey. It's a piece of a tree that was intertwined with the telephone wires outside. And I'm showing this to you all because I oftentimes with my work, with sculpture, work at least one piece that's somewhat improvisational or is not something that I own myself. And that's in a kind of like resignation of this idea of authorship and mastery with sculpture that is so often people are, in the discipline, they're like, I am the master of welding or I am the master woodworker. And I really want to push back against that in that, yes, you can be very good about those things, but there are objects in this world that are out of your control, and those are equally valid as artworks, as something that's masterfully created. So this is, going back to the idea of water, this is the cast of a bison stomach. It's quite large. It's about that by this. This is one of the first sculptures that I made in bronze. Bison stomachs were traditionally water bottles for indigenous people in the western United States. And so the museum was deacquisitioning a teaching tool, which was this like rotting stomach. And I thought, wow, that's really cool. I'm taking that and I'm going to turn it into a sculpture. So again, the water thematic as a kind of driving material or driving inquiry into making objects is starting to come forward here. This is a fountain that I made called Fountain Number 1, CG Roxanne East. And this is, again, as I'm trying to question the ideas of that sculptures are traditionally made, I have a whole series of fountain works, and they work with water in different forms than people normally think would exist for a fountain. So in the case of this sculpture, it is with bottled water. And the water that this fountain uses is specifically sourced from Olancha, California, which is in the Sierra Nevada mountains. And so I took this water and carried it with me to the eastern side of the Mississippi River, where I was having this show in Detroit, and so I brought this kind of reverse migration of this western water to an eastern site, and then the fountain ran on bottled water. It's a little bit of a stretch to say that it actually runs, because when you run the fountain, it's the bottles have a pin in it, and you remove the pin, and it slowly drips from this small bottle here down into the larger bottle, and then that leaks through this piece of hollow core door into this tin can, which, oops, my slides are a little out of order. The tin can eventually leaks onto these iced tea cans. Here's the water in the dripping into the crystal geyser bottle, and then from the iced tea cans, the water eventually leaks into this bottom tray, which is made of bronze, although it looks like cardboard. So here is boxes of crystal geyser water transported from the source in the Sierra Nevada mountains to Detroit, Michigan. So to show you briefly these kind of compass point sculptures, the bottom of these is bronze casts that are made from bison scapula. Scapula is the part of your body back here where your arm attaches to your shoulder. And in traditional ways, with indigenous people, but then also Western settlers, the scapula was often used as signposts. So I was working with the scapula as a form, and then it extended, again, somewhat accidentally, into these longer sticks. And on each, stick hung an object that I found in the landscape on one of these points along the migratory pathways that I had been traveling. So this sculpture overall is called East. It's quite tall, it's 106 inches. The materials are raw bronze, hollow core door, accessory cord, neon glass tubing, sourced from an abandoned China buffet in Evanston, Wyoming, found object, and fire. So this is the raw bronze down here, found object. The hollow core door is stuck to the wall with this piece of found plastic webbing. This is north. Here a little bit better, you can see that the neon glass tubing, the accessory cord runs through that tubing and creates these shapes that form this line that hangs down from the top of the stick. In the found object here, this is a clay pigeon for shotgun shooting practice that I found out in the landscape. It's a very traditional Western thing to do. Go take your gun and shoot at things in the air. This is south. I believe that this found object here is some kind of toilet ring. So again, the toilet gasket, again, the water thematic coming up. And then this is west. So these polls happened somewhat accidentally for me as these sign markers, but I really liked working with it as a sculptural form, and I was feeling a lot more comfortable about making sculptures and being intentional with that. The works were also inspired by a school of Japanese minimalism called mono-ha, which gets shown somewhat regularly in Los Angeles, but is works with a lot of found and natural materials and trying to just present those things as they are. But I wanted to actually then, as I was feeling more confident in making sculptures, it seemed to me like, well, I've been looking at so much mono-ha work, I should really start to actually consider the legacy of American landscape artwork. So I started to think more about minimal land works, and there's a lot of different reference points here, but I'm just going to show you one for now, and that's The Lightning Field by Walter de Maria, which is installed in a field in the rural northwestern New Mexico from 1977, this piece. It's stainless steel, and the dimensions are 1 mile by 1 kilometer. So just to read to you from the Dia Foundation in New York owns this work, so to speak, and what they say about it is, The Lightning Field by American sculptor Walter de Maria is a work of land art situated in a remote area of the high desert of western New Mexico. It's comprised of 400 polished stainless steel poles installed in a grid array measuring 1 mile by 1 kilometer. The poles, 2 inches in diameter and averaging 20 feet and 7 inches in height, are spaced 220 feet apart and have solid pointed tips that define a horizontal plane. The sculpture to be walked in as well as viewed, the lightning field is intended to be experienced over an extended period of time. A full experience of the lightning field does not depend upon the occurrence of lightning, and visitors are encouraged to spend as much time as possible in the field, especially during sunset and sunrise. I have not seen this artwork in person. I hope to go there sometime soon, but it's quite difficult to get to. So I've had a bit of an obsession with this work for a couple of years now. And starting in 2020, I also was preparing for a show where I teach at Dartmouth College, and was focusing on a new site at the very edge of the western expanse, the beach, where the water meets the land. And specifically, I was looking at a place called Black's Beach. So Black's Beach is outside of San Diego, and it's a kind of historical gathering spot for what some people might call alternative sorts. And so it's famous for being a really good surf spot. It's also a nude beach, and there's a fairly well-known gay section to that nude beach. This site to me is kind of the very, very edge of the modernist West, where the land ends at the water's beginning. And I thought it was kind of interesting that at this limit, where things are pushed to the absolute extreme, this is only where these these activities can occur that some people might consider to be deviant. So the beach, this is the beach itself. It's really quite beautiful. But as you can see, you're standing up on this kind of cliff bluff thing. This is down on the beach. So to get there, you have to scramble down this crazy pathway that's like a trail of death down the cliff. And I show you all this because it's people do it still because this place is important and sacred for those who actually want to get there. You really have to want it, but if you want it, you can do whatever you want. So at the far northern end of the beach, there's this bamboo outcropping here, and the far northern end is the gay section, which is also nude. And this bamboo outcropping is a site for cruising and public sex. So, predominantly men, on days when the beach are nice, sort of gather around this area and go inside of it to have sex publicly. I became interested in this site and that architecture as a form in itself, a kind of provisional dwelling. So I went to Dartmouth to make this show where I was going to, work based off of that site. And then COVID happened, and everything got really weird. And so the works that came out of that I was prevented from actually going back to the beach because I was teaching and there was quarantine, and the works kind of took on their own life accordingly. There's an essay that artist Jules Gimbrone wrote for a show that I had of these works in Chicago, a show called Fruit Flies from earlier this year, and I'm just going to read a couple paragraphs of that essay as I flip through some images because they do a better job of explaining the works than I do myself. I first visited Matt's studio overlooking the Mascoma River in Lebanon, New Hampshire in January of 2020. We were both recently displaced adjuncts teaching one short semester at the nearby college, and we had become fast friends. Half arranged throughout the studio sat assorted pieces of detritus I recognized from the local co-op grocery store. That same type of green bean bag, that expensive eco-detergent bottle you can occasionally get on sale, twisted into a reconstitution of noble garbage, a queer repurposing, turning and perverting the quotidian. Like a blooming fruit fly colony, I suddenly saw these hidden beings in full light. A sequence of folded fabric and tarp triangles were suspended between a series of tall bamboo poles, an allusion to a bamboo sex hut at Black's Beach in San Diego that Matt planned to visit in March of 2020. This paradise, glimmering with naked asses, would remain a mirage. Unextracted and unmined in the quarantine refusal of travel, the plans were thwarted like so many things, ideas of ourselves, goals and ambitions, and rolling forward head tucked into a protective pose to stave off a certain decay. We both ended up staying in New England during the quarantine, and the cloth structure folded, a queer sex fort in the California sun, a collection of sand and seaweed, leather and skin, salted and rare, never harvested. The form I first saw in his studio, the fabric stretching over the bamboo like a skin, has now dissolved to lay bare the essence of its skeletal structure. Only the poles remain. In a scrap of email, Matt said to me, artwork made in nostalgia for the Pacific's edge that then decomposed and rotted under COVID quarantine. These bony earthworms collected and attracted the cast-offs of a more organic life, their outer layers holding peeled skins of other forms, matter folded and fitted upon themselves, wasted plastics, Xanax RX, 7th generation dishwasher gel, Poland Springs sparkling water, bathroom reading materials, local publications for Vermont Green Living, queer leather journals brought back from LA home, a CD, Tetra Paks for soup stocks, etc., etc. These were lightning rods magnetizing our junk. Yet there is an ordinary alchemy in being with our decomposing things. A compression of time creates a sort of talisman to our knowing. The kind of grounded spiritual reveal that comes from, for example, digging out an ancient Roman garbage dump, a midden, and finding scraps of torn pornography detailing sexual positions, olive pits, and wine bottles. This floats and populates our lives and is cast off into the pits of refuse, not to remain stoic and unchanging on hearths and altars. Pressure builds inside these mounds of decomposition, and like carbon turning into diamonds, we see something transformed and also still itself. In this show, I also included another fountain. This is fountain number 2, Point Doom. And this is materials for this are Pacific Ocean, Queen Palm Nut, and Erewhon Market Sustainable Grocery Bag. So like the first fountain I showed you, I carried water from the Pacific Ocean to Chicago, and then also these palm nuts, and froze them into ice cubes. And every day during the show, the fountain ran by melting ice cubes on an organic grocery store bag. This is another view of the show. Just to pause on an individual work here, one of the individual poles. This is called sun bum. They're all called sun bums, and then each has a kind of designator. So this is sun bum deli bag. And the materials are bamboo, PVC, acrylic, recycled plastics, e.g. Poland Spring, sparkling water, Xanax RX, 7th generation dishwasher gel, a CD, bathroom reading materials, local publications for Vermont Green Living, queer leather journals brought back from LA home, sand from West Cotty Head, Maine, and resin. And these are very tall, over 3 meters. They each have little paintings on them that serve as these kind of coding markers. They look like pieces of tape, but they're actually paintings. This is the base here. It's a deli bag with rocks from the easternmost point of the United States in it, since I couldn't get to the West Coast. And then here we have the fountain again with the melting ice cube. 2 more sunbums, sunbum tofu on the right, and then sunbum vinegar on the left. Detail at the top of the sunbum vinegar. Again, you can see perhaps a little bit better here that this is painted on, although it has a trompe-l'oeil tape effect. The base of that sculpture is a vinegar bottle, again with the rocks from Cotty Head, Maine. And then this is sunbum powered by plants. So in that show, accompanying the fountain and the poles was something called Dirt Piece, and this was a display of slides aligned on the windows of the gallery. We'll come back to that in a minute. But prior to that, I just want to show you the booth from Lista with some of the other works in it that relate to these poles but are a little newer. This is Lista. So for Lista, I revisited this idea but wanted to make, with these larger poles where I was sort of imagining that the sculpture would approach you as a viewer, I wanted to create some sculptures where the viewer approached the sculpture as the subject, so kind of reversing the idea of subject and object. Kind of working with this idea that your body approaches the sculpture in a mode of like possession or control. This is stick number 2, bamboo, PVC, acrylic, watercolor, newspaper, copper, and other found material. So these poles were actually all made from material that I found at the site at Black's, finally. So this stick uses a found tent pole from Black's. In the parking lot on the cliffs above the beach, it's clear, kind of like the canyon, that there's some people who are using the place as a site to live. And that some people it's voluntary and other people not, van life, if you will. Again, and so I'm kind of curious as to like how this sort of fringe piece of public land, the kind of last place that you can possibly go, becomes this meeting point for different marginalized communities. So with these smaller poles, the paintings that I had done on the larger ones took different forms, but each of them is kind of coding or signaling. This is stick number 5, bamboo, PVC, acrylic, watercolor, sand, and other found materials. And sometimes I think of these sculptures as tools, but in a more abstract rather than a prescriptive sense. This is stick number 1. And I just want to pause here quickly to just state that, a lot of this work that I'm making has a really, really sort of casual appearance to it. But as I've gone on and made more and more sculpture, making objects that look casual or sort of provisional yet have integrity as sculptural objects is actually really, really difficult. And so I've become a sort of mastermind about adhesives. And so something like this sculpture, which seems like a bunch of stuff just kind of stuck together and sticking out of each other, actually requires 4 or 5 different types of adhesives to get it to hold form. So sometimes the things that are simplest or seem the most provisional are actually the hardest, the kind of disappearing labor. This is stick number 4. The top of this uses a plastic container for a joint that is now repurposed into a flower vase. So this is a functioning flower vase, but you can only show a mini rose in it. The bottom of it is a used bottle of lubricant. So just north of that bamboo area, as you can see here, is a bluff with all these little pathways. And this is another site where people kind of go up and wander around and meet other people for public sex. And what I was kind of curious about is that, that's the bluff itself, but in those areas, occasionally people will put down objects that seem slightly out of place. And, those objects are actually codes for other people to stop. And if you stop there and hang out long enough, someone might approach you. So it's kind of this, secret messaging for like, here's a spot where we can meet and connect. So I've been interested in these objects in that they are converted by someone else from garbage into actually a sculpture in its own right, because it has the value of it has transformed from a garbage value to an aesthetic value, and that it's signaling to someone else a message. And then I have collected some of these objects myself and made them sculptures. So this piece called XX is 2 different found objects from blacks that have to be installed together in the same room. So in the booth, they were installed on opposite sides. Here you can see the balloon, and then over here is the bottle. The only installation prescriptive that I have about this is that they need to be at least 2 body lengths apart, which is what I determined would be the comfortable distance for 2 different groups of people having public sex. These, just as a little bit of other kind of documentary, photographic insight for you, these are other markers, so to speak. This one's obviously a lot more blatant, and this one is more subtle. So with the coupling the bronze, the work from Black's Beach on the Pacific coast, a kind of counterpoint that I developed was the working from the banks of the Mississippi River. Specifically, I've worked from right under the St. Louis Arch in St. Louis, Missouri. So the arch itself was designed by Eero Saarinen, I believe that's how you say his name, constructed in 1965, a monument to westward expansion, and arguably it's the tallest man-made monument in the Western Hemisphere. Many people call it the gateway to the West. So I collect objects from the kind of riverbanks right here below the arch. And again, that's a kind of mixed-use site, somewhat like Black's. People use it for cruising or for loitering, excuse me. And so, the items in these trays that I make are all collected from this riverfront. Let's see. So again, they're marking the edge of the kind of idea of the modernist West, but it's on the east side of the eastern side of that expanse. So you can't really quite tell from these images, but the outer tray here is bronze, You can see a bit here that the white is painted on in that area there, but here you can see this bronze tray. That's the trays at the foundry. So I've made a bunch of these, and we can flip through them kind of quickly, but again, the idea is that these are this sort of monuments of one edge of this idea of the modernist West, but a kind of a queer monument, if you will. So just coming back briefly to the fruit fly show and that the slides on the window. I've talked about that these sculptures that I now make come out of performance, and that's not something I engage in so much anymore. But that's kind of a lie, because I still think about doing performance works, and it was more of a matter of how I could find a new way into it for my own brain so it would be interesting or compelling to me, and also thinking about it as a landscape work. And I finally figured that out, actually, in 2020 with a piece that I called Dirt Piece. As it's described in the materials list, the work is dirt piece. From the eastern to the western limits of a territory, kiss the ground every 100 miles. This first iteration was from October 19th through November 1st, 2020. So in the fruit fly show, these slides from all the stops going across the United States were displayed on the windows in sequential order. And then this is the map of my route as I went from Algonquin, Maine, traveling across the country to Long Beach, Washington, stopping and kissing the ground every 100 miles. This also happened to go through the exact center point of the United States, which is in Lebanon, Kansas. So I did this right, actually, the 2 weeks before the 2020 election. It's also right in the middle of the worst part of the pandemic in the Midwest. It's an interesting experience. So this artwork, in the fruit fly show, I showed it as these slides on the wall, but it actually can take various forms. It can be a slide projection, or I'm fine with it living as images digitally as well. And so I'm going to actually just show you all of the stops in this one iteration here. And as far as I'm concerned, this is actually as much the artwork as the installation in the show in Chicago. So I'm just going to not say anything and flip through them. This is beginning in Maine. That's the Pacific. So to leave you off here, again, the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic. Edges of the country, just flat. Thanks.
Thank you. All right. I guess.
Just before you start, I'm happy to go through and flip back to any of the work, or I can go through and show you Dirt Piece again if people would like to see that in sequence. I realize I just flew through a lot of work, but there's lots to cover.
Are there any sort of like initial, like more technical questions or things that lingering as Matt was showing? I mean, otherwise, then I would like to sort of like open it up by maybe talking a little bit more overall, also giving a little bit of a context for, and you touched on it in a lot of ways, but this idea of the frontier. I think also basically how, in relationship to what that means to Europeans, like, and how that is, it is this sort of very interesting relationship that it's something I feel like we are probably not that familiar with or fairly alienated to, or can even like write off as a sort of like an American thing on the one hand, and then at the same time, you know, the frontier impulse comes from Europe. It comes from the sort of like desire to escape the sort of Anglo-Saxon condition and territory at a point where Europe was getting too cramped, and it was this idea of like seeking out new land, new unpopulated territory, and a sort of like a second chance to basically refine the sort of like the European idea of freedom, but sort of like that kept refining itself in its movement westward, something like that. So there, I think it's interesting that your talk and your work here ends with this sort of like sequence of images as also sort of like documenting this movement westwards. But also, I mean, with a completely different sort of like pretense to it. I think I would like to think, and also I think that seems very apparent, there's not like the incentive for you to do this movement is, you know, informed by totally different sort of like ideas than the original sort of like settler movement and in its progression.
Yeah. I mean, the idea was actually to kind of like hollow out and empty out that sort of, as you were talking about, this idea of freedom, right? So this gesture of, you know, you get out and you kiss the ground. Mm-hmm. This is a could be interpreted as a kind of frontierist gesture of like, I've reached the untouched land. I'm kissing Mother Earth. And so my idea with that work was that, you know, by doing it consistently across the entire country and framing the documentation in this way that my face is in the exact same spot every single time, it's like it's that idea with kind of with semiotics, that if you have a word that you know and you say it over and over, like banana, 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 eventually banana stops meaning banana, and it doesn't have its meaning anymore. And so my idea in that sense was to, you know, do this kissing gesture all the way across, and hopefully it would become almost like insidious in that it's like it doesn't have the meaning of having reached a new place because it's just happening over and over again. So what are you reaching if you're reaching everything? I will also say I just showed it to you going from the Atlantic to the Pacific, and that's how I did that travel. But I don't. When I showed the work in Chicago, it was actually sequenced the other way, and to me, the work doesn't really have one orientation. Yes, I moved across the country in one specific direction, but as the piece exists now, I'm equally fine showing the East Coast as the beginning or the West Coast as the beginning. And so, again, that's a way for me to kind of undercut this idea of, moving into the frontier, moving to the West, in that there's no sort of set orientation of this kind of expansive movement. That was the idea with it, at least.
Yeah.
But again, just trying to think about, going back to talking about minimal landscape-based artworks, and oftentimes these things are employ modes of repetition or geometry. In the case of lightning fields, it's the lightning field rather. It's a field of these poles, and so I was thinking about those kind of monumental earthworks, but doing it in a way that was like one of my favorite earthworks of all time is a Bruce Nauman sculpture that's a skywriting piece. So he hired a plane to go up in the sky, and they skywriting is I don't know how it does it, but that magic where it leaves the clouds that spell out letters, and it just says, "Leave the land alone." And so I was, thinking well, how can I think about making an earthwork? I consider that piece to be an earthwork, but in a way that it actually just doesn't fuck with the earth.
Yeah.
One other point about it that I'm not totally. I don't make mention of it. It's visible in some of the images, but not always. But each day it took me, I think, 7 days or 8 days to do that performance, and so I wore a different outfit each day. But I also, as a kind of nod towards a queering of this, and it's sort of hokey in a way, but it also is a form of mark making. I wore a different lipstick each day for when I did that kiss, and prior to doing the kiss, I apply the lipstick, and then I blotted my lips on just a blank postcard that I made out of watercolor paper. And from each site where I stopped to touch the ground, I mailed the postcard from the local post office with a post stamp. So I actually also have this a kind of drawing record that is a discrete physical documentation. Is a kind of sculptural record, but in two-dimensional form. And again, the lipstick thing is a sort of nod to it's like a man wearing lipstick. It's sort of hokey, but I think it gets the idea across. So you can't always see it in the slideshow, but ideally it would be nice to show those documenting cards with the work as well. I haven't actually. I finished this piece, like I said, last November, and I have been planning to show it in a large form at this show at the Armory in Pasadena in California. And that has been constantly pushed back because of COVID reasons. So when that happens, it'll be fully realized.
Yeah. To me, and I think more overall, and it's totally forcing an interpretation onto you, but I can't help thinking about also sort of this work as sort of informed, by the affect of that frontier myth, but also that how that has been so, it's become such an integral part to sort of like American self-understanding. We can also talk about how that maybe relates to this idea of Americana, but like in thinking about this sort of like the frontier movement, and I'm relying here also like on Greg Grandin's book about the end of myth that sort of traces the American frontier and its history to basically Trump's border wall. And he's arguing that, you know, the initial incentive for the you know, the frontier movement, the escape from Europe is...
Sorry, escape from...
The escape from Europe, the escape from the old world is this idea of that you had a social state that wanted to regulate certain behaviors that were at odds with like liberalist thought. So frontierism is also, in a sense, a right to, you know, insist on the sort of like the freedom of from any kind of restraint, in a sense, combined with then sort of like traversing a landscape. And for the longest time, frontierism is associated with borders, is associated with the landscape exactly, until it basically hits the West Coast. And there's no more landscape to traverse. Then that sort of like freedom is then sort of like transformed into foreign wars and to war veterans that are sent abroad to expand the American freedom on foreign territory. But again, this sort of like, but to take that frontier idea further. But also it becomes more and more sort of an abstract concept, and it becomes a sort of like part of an American identity of frontierism. As it kind of runs out of land, it becomes a sort of like the freedom from restraint of any kind of thing, also being like psychological.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to hear you. I haven't read that book, so not familiar with that theory at all. But I think of the way that, like, so yes, you know, frontierism, the idea of the frontier, hit the Pacific Ocean and kind of ended, and then actually went up to Alaska. But more culturally, as far as I understand it, I think about this sense of frontierism actually goes psychological in terms of people's then their interest in kind of like a sort of like, you know, for lack of better words, a spiritual frontierism. And in the case of the West Coast, that's when you start to get like, you know, communes and hippies and New Age, and acid and drugs. So like there's this, you know, and this is what the 1960s became. It's like the frontier of the mind. And when the frontier of the land is somewhat closed down, people want to keep expanding and keep kind of pushing the edge. Where is the edge? And now to me that seems like it's more gone into like a tech thing, for better and for worse. And so it's funny, you know, you're talking about like, oh, this idea of the frontier might be somewhat foreign to people who live in Europe, except now there's the internet and, you know, this kind of way of a sort of technological frontier. And that's not really my thing, so I don't want to go into it too much, but the frontier is available to you here too, just through your iPhone.
No, I mean, you can also try to apply the frontier logic even to an enterprise such as like Documenta, in terms of like a frontier. There is basically no issue too complex for the sort of frontier of Documenta to deal with, you know, in how it sort of like invades new areas, or like, I mean, and that's the beauty of it. It has a kind of like a really beautiful ambiguity to it. But I do think that, I mean, but just to stick with the sort of Greg Grandin's theory, is just like, he basically, his argument is, it is when Trump introduces the border wall, that's where it's like, there's no more territory to conquer. Now we're entering a mode of like defense. It's a fort. Like the settlement it becomes fortified, it becomes the castle, it becomes not letting in the Mexicans, but it also becomes that the U.S. is sort of like, and that's maybe because I think I wrote that in the sort of press thing for this, the Oscar winner, like Nomadland, like it becomes this sort of like circuit of like frontierism just becomes this sort of movement within the U.S. for these people that are used to sort of like traverse landscape but doesn't really have anywhere else to go. And I think like your work is interesting because it is, to me, it really sort of like acknowledges the sort of like idea of the exhausted plot of this movement. And it really sort of like mines these objects, but also that psychology in the wake of a frontierist movement, being it a mindset or even a geographical expanse.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely is acknowledging this exhausted plot line, but it's to a certain extent, it's like, well, it's exhausted for the narratives that we already know. How are other people and other groups able to occupy that space now?
Yeah.
And so it's like, I like to think of it as like, yes, it's critical in that sense, but it's also somewhat positivist because, you know, this is a place where like now people who haven't been allowed to have a conversation in the ideas of, you know, their sense of landscape and the edge, so to speak, can now occupy that space or find that space as a safe space. You know, in the case of Black speech, that like there actually is still a pocket of land there, and that spot is this safe kind of safe haven for all sorts of, you know, people who are pushed out from, you know, like in suburbia encroaching everywhere else in California in the West, and they have this little pocket of land that's actually a little slice of frontier because it is the very edge. It's like 20 feet of frontier, but they can still find and use it for purposes that are new to them.
No, and I think that, I mean, to me, there's that something, I mean, in that, and then the sort of like St. Louis Gateway, there is something about you sort of like combing through these sites that are, I mean, but that within that sort of like set of rhetorics is so, it's so based on a sense of locomotion, a sense of like forward movement. And, so it's almost, you know, you were showing the Fraser sculpture, that sort of like, that which is so much about a sort of dynamics, and in this, you know, it being sort of like the exhausted indigenous person, but it's like still, it orients itself towards the West, right? But you're actually looking at the terroir, the site, you know, which is, it's just a kind of a different mode.
I'm glad you bring up that sculpture because those, if I can find the slides here.
That sculpture, do you mean the art or that?
Yeah. I have two, this and with the Remington here, the Met provided these native perspectives on both of these works that I have here in my notes, and I think it's interesting to hear these perspectives in relationship to these works, so I can read them quickly to you. So on James Earl Fraser, End of the Trail, and this is 1918, cast in 1918, but there are earlier versions of this sculpture. It's seemingly ubiquitous. So Jeffrey Gibson, who's Choctaw Cherokee, says, I remember visiting the Cherokee gift shop as a kid where small novelty versions of this sculpture were for sale. At the time, I saw it as an image of a shamed, defeated Indian, and I wondered if this was really how the rest of the world viewed us. Over the years, I went to powwows with my family where I saw End of the Trail screen printed on flags used in ceremonies honoring veterans and prisoners of war. It was a symbol that had been completely reinvented in a native context. I continue to have ambivalent feelings about this image, but I understand that for many it is a symbol of resilience and strength, characteristics traditionally associated with the warrior. And then on the Remington, Margaret Jacobs, who is Ashkenazi Mohawk, says, after regularly seeing casts and reproductions of the Bronco Buster at my first job at the Frederick Remington Art Museum in Ogdensburg, New York, I am now quick to spot them in museums, flea markets, movies, and magazines. The piece seems to be everywhere, representing the epitome of what many believe a cowboy to be and what Remington hoped he would embody, the last frontiersman and the master of a nation born out of wilderness, subsisting on an unsettled magical land. I still wonder, as I did frequently when I was younger, why this artist, who lived so close to the Ashkenazi Mohawk Reservation in upstate New York, traveled so far to the west to find his native subjects. Maybe too many Indians and not enough cowboys would have crushed his mythos of the American West.
Just to bring, because I would like to do this sort of like parallel read, but there is, and I'm also relying here on the LA-based sculptor Charles Ray's take on especially the Fraser sculptor. He's done a piece that is sort of like in solid aluminum. It's just in Chicago. It's called Horse and Rider. And so he basically takes this, the exhausted Indian and applies that to the sort of like slightly disillusioned cowboy, but also as sort of like interesting comment to the equestrian statue as we know it from Europe of the monarch, of the king as conqueror, as sort of like dressed, as a Roman emperor, as somebody that sort of like is victorious in securing the territory within the sort of like European. And he talks about how once that's, the equestrian statue, the horse rider statue, moves onto American soil, like the sort of connotation shifts for that. And the cowboy as this sort of like disillusioned conqueror, the tired Marlboro man, and also in the face exactly as you were saying here with these, where at this point that one side of the truth kind of exhausts this idea of like the heroic picture of the cowboy. And I'm interested in, I feel like there's almost a melancholy in your approach to using bronze in your work, like in basically taking on this sort of, as you're saying, this sort of like casual, monumental in the pieces.
Yeah, it's interesting to actually that you brought this Charles Ray sculpture into the conversation. I was actually not familiar with this work. But one thing with Charles Ray's sculptures that I think is really adds to the meaning in a way that I don't really fully understand is that these are solid aluminum. And so, most large-scale sculptures of metal are hollow. And he's chosen to make these aluminum pieces solid. They weigh a ton. And I don't quite understand what that does for the work, but it definitely, it concretizes something else that I can't quite put my finger on. And to sort of relate, what I like about that is that, and this is how I can kind of relate back to my working with bronze, is that, there's a kind of, in his case, it's about like super weight and super mass. And in my case, it's about like using bronze, which is like heavy, eternal, etc., and trying to make it disappear or trying to make it delicate, which I've done in other sculptures that I haven't shown you here. But as related to the Charles Ray work, it's a kind of perversion of these metal materials that have a very specific place in our understanding of historical monuments. He does it in a way that's like extra monumental, like extra perverse, and mine is more about like trying to like hollow it out. And melancholy, you might call it melancholy. I think of it as a kind of like an inversion or something like that. But bronze is really fun for me to work in because it's such an easy target. It has these qualities that are so iconic, and to make like a slight sculpture with bronze, or make something in bronze and have it disappear, it's like you can just undercut it left and right. And to me, that's like a way that I feel like I can have some voice with bronze, which is actually a really, really cool material to work with sculpturally. Metal is really fun. It is has a history that goes back to the Stone Ages, or the Iron Age, whatever. I'm not a historian or a materials historian in that sense, but it's to me it's extra satisfying to be able to enter that very, very long history, but able in a way that is my own voice and my own sensibility with the material.
But can you? Because I do think that there's just like something about bronze and in relationship to sort of like this idea of Americana, which is also a very sort of like elastic term. But relating to the Fraser sculpture and which is also, there is one in the Autry's collection, right? And how all the American bronze work that we know is, I think is sort of like from high modernism. Yeah. This is so there's that thing of when bronze sort of lends itself to rendering sort of figurative form, it is pretty much like that kind of I don't know if you can really make that harsh a distinction, but it definitely associates some sort of Americana. But also, like, Americana is also almost a sort of like derogatory term of like a spell. Once you're in the sort of like Americana, that kind of means you're part of this exhausted plot, right? Yeah. You're recognizable in that sense. And I feel like that's also what you're talking about, these people, for example, these sort of like contemporary gold miners, or the people in nomad land that are sort of hailed as these voluntary nomads. Or some of these people are staying out of these valleys, like voluntarily, some are not. There's that sort of like how also sort of like U.S. desperation swallows you and renders you as this sort of like involuntary piece of Americana. Yeah. And I feel like that your work really also constantly deals with that, is that threshold constantly of one.
It's like it's an edge that I try and ride, and it's. That's like going back to the mining work. Like, I'm very specific about not representing people or not trying to tell the stories, so to speak, because it's, I can't, like the Americana, like where the people are actually forced into, this kind of drifter lifestyle because of economic reasons. I don't want to be the one that's like telling that story or treating them as objects. And I lost my train of thought here a little bit, but point being, like the sculpture itself is, trying to work from that line of like where the Americana of being a nomadic or being on the frontier, where there's like the forced Americana of desperation versus the, kitsch Americana of the museum. And a lot of the sculpture that I make is trying to like very delicately straddle that line, in that it's, these classic American themes that are, part of the canon, so to speak, but have also taken a really like, a desperate edge because of, dare I say it, late stage capitalism. People in America, that like the subprime mortgage crisis really caused a lot of people to actually, become nomads, a la the Nomadland movie. And, that's the gears of the machine, just, forcing people to be the frontiers people because they don't have money to pay the rent anymore. So, working off of that space, but also realizing that is like, this frontierism, if you will, is like part of almost a legacy of American kitsch.
Exactly.
Which I would like to think of as camp. And that, from my perspective at least, and only because I'm trying to take it and throw it back in the face of, the frontierists that created it to begin with.
Yeah.
But that's maybe another discussion.
No, but I remember when I wrote you about this, and we had a small discussion. And I said, maybe as a topic we could talk about, or that the work that it also touched on the subject of white poverty, and you wrote me back and said I would rather. I think you said something about I'd rather that the work is seen as a consequence of and particularly American capitalism. And how there's that desperation in it. But I think that one of the things I also ask you then is yes, but it's just how do you distinguish, this sort of contemporary, Nomadland desperation from the original frontier desperation, which was also a part of the motivation to move westward. And it's just really, there is within that mix, there is a really big point where it was also about whiteness. It was about a sort of Anglo-Saxon idea of looking over a country as an empty land when it was in fact full, and just not recognizing a race.
Yeah.
But can you talk a little bit more about that? What's the difference between?
Yeah. I'm just gonna. You talked about. I want to pull up this painting again.
Yeah. And also just to throw in Nomadland, I think there's one of the things, to me at least, for why that thing is such a weird. It's also because it really is weirdly slippery in how it subscribes to these ideas of frontierism, but also how it is such a sort of in terms of politics, it's a weird moderate version of things. It deals with, for example, white poverty, but it doesn't, it doesn't show the piss bottles at the Amazon compound. It doesn't show the MAGA hats in the trailers.
It's only shot at magic hour.
Yeah, exactly. Sorry?
Did you read it?
I did not read it, no.
I heard it's much more dark than just...
Yeah, absolutely. But that's even, it premiered on Disney Channel when it was finally released. And, it's, Chloe Chow is not an American. And it's kind of interesting also to sort of see how it's a little bit the same way they bring in this director to deal with the Star Wars franchise, because it's just the politics in that are just so important. You need you don't need an auteur. You need a moderator to sort of care for these interests. So we also need. So there's somebody, I can't even remember the source, but somebody talking about that movie being a moderate version to basically make this idea of white poverty as sort of frontier glamorous image or something like that.
Yeah. Not to mention that Frances McDormand, interloped with the actual communities of people who are nomadic, but not as an actor, and then didn't tell them. It's problematic, to say the least. But to go back to what you were originally wanting me to talk about, you mentioned this idea of the kind of white poverty, and as being a sort of condition of the nomad or the frontierist, if you will, and as that reflected in my work. And I do remember this, I responded back, well, no, actually, this is not entirely what the my work is about, because it's not, again, there's these storylines or these spaces can be re-inhabited by marginalized communities that haven't had a stake at the table in conversations about land, and in my case, landscape art, or sort of like actually participating in a kind of frontier life, if you will. And so I said that my work is actually more an acknowledgement of a kind of, it's less about a sort of white poverty and more about the marginalized community of queer people who are now being able to use this space and populate it for their own purposes. And so, the work that I make is kind of in a recognition of that, and a sort of, meanwhile, like there, as you mentioned, there is this kind of, there's the Americana camp, but there is also the desperation. And so it's like all these marginalized communities, they are like pushed into this frontier space, and well, how can that actually be productive? And like, what way can that be a source of empowerment? Or in the case of, say, Black's Beach and my work there, like sexual liberation. And so I tend to think about the sculpture that I make as, more about, those places as a site of a kind of new freedom, but freedom for other peoples. Does that sort of spell it out a little bit more?
No, absolutely. I guess, because at this point it's almost as if, freedom has gotten a pretty bad name. Yeah. There's also been sort of like legitimating reasons to fight wars abroad and stuff like that. So I can see that you're also, in a sense, trying to, approach it, well, I guess a more sort of like personal, sexual liberating or broadening perspective of these things. I'm thinking maybe because time is like approaching, maybe we should like also hear if there's any like questions. I
have a question that's maybe a segue. For one thing, I wanted to push back on your read of bronze. I think it is, above all, a signifier of monumentality, and not especially of Americana. I think you walk through Europe, and there are bronze monuments in every square of many cities. And, we're in a moment where, that kind of monument is being questioned in the States in particular. But, to me, I think bronze is much more a sort of, ubiquitous material of permanence and sculpture in that way, and less American per se. And I think, and to me, that the way you're using it really ties in with a lot of your other materials in terms of how tenuous it feels, that it there's so much recycled bits and other people's detritus and stuff, and that it has that fragility that you talked about, and also evokes a temporality while being in this super permanent material. Right. And I had been wondering, so that's my segue, and I was wondering if that resonates, and more generally, if you could talk more about your material choices. You kind of framed the talk initially about queering the landscape, and I remembered at the time you saying landscape painting, but I'm guessing after the talk that it was just landscape. But there's that tenuousness and that sort of fragility and temporality of your materials, to me, reflects the ambivalence with which you kind of began the lecture around the ambivalence around objects. But it also quotes, because of that framing of queering the landscape, I read it as like quoting the sort of queer and feminist history of collage from, a historical era before those communities were, given access to the same resources as the sort of moneyed art world. Not that it was that moneyed at the time, but and the history of that. And then also I think there's this element of late capitalism and of like an eco-consciousness and of like our relationship to trash and permanence in that way, which you didn't mention, but you talking about the landscape made me think of it. And so I wondered if that resonates with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, materials, I'm like a real kind of materials fetishist in a way. And, I didn't talk about trash. I have a lot to say about that. But it is, as I have been, I'm extremely conscious about creating more things and creating more things where things haven't been before in a world that's like plastic bottles are, forming islands in the oceans. And so part of the reason of using recycled or found materials is like in this way of like, well, I'm just like part of this great recycling machine of garbage in the world, but just changing the use value of garbage from like having a trash value or waste value to having an aesthetic value. Hit kind of a bunch of points with materials there. I'm maybe to start with the bronze. Like, yes, you're totally right. For me, it is kind of like about undercutting a monumentality and sort of playing with that material in a way that is like seems fragile or seems provisional, as you said, or seems invisible. But at the same time, it's like I said before, it is bronze and it has this huge history within sculpture. And as someone who has has had kind of a unusual relationship with the discipline, it is like, for me, it feels like kind of a riposte back to the kind of capital S monumental discourses of sculpture in the United States, just working with that material, like it's like I can have the cake and eat it too, because it actually is monumental in a sense of eternalness, right? Bronze is not going to go away unless it heats up to 2,000 degrees or something like that. But at the same time, it doesn't take on the permanence of like the weight and the mass that people typically associate with bronze. In terms of the other materials and the provisionality of it, there is definitely, like, I've had a long engagement with collage and bricolage, over the years, and that's, there's just sometimes these things in your practice that you can't get away from. Like, you can't get away from yourself and your methods of working. And the way that I work with sculptural materials now is often like the way that I used to work in 2D with collage, or the way that I would maybe construct, performances before, where it was like grabbing of all of these different source texts and reference points and a piling of references and signifiers. The materials that I collect and work with are just a kind of reinvention of that. But I'm actually trying to get away from that slightly, in that for me, as I go on making objects and I become more and more engaged with that as a discipline, I'm increasingly interested in clarity and in the work having a sort of singularity in its vision that can be very deep, while also like really straightforward. And so it's kind of a balancing act of like, well, how do I enjoy materials. I think they're fascinating. I have a materials library in my studio. How do I still do that and, honor this part of my my working process where I like to go around and collect things, but then create works that have a sort of discrete clarity to them. And I actually feel that some of these works that I made recently for Lista, I was able to achieve that to a certain extent. If I can scroll through these slides, there's so many slides. Yeah, I mean, again, it's like the provisionality of the materials, the collage, it is, again, an undercutting of the monumental. But now it's like, for me, it's like, well, how can this undercut those things in a way that relates to, like you mentioned, feminism or, the other sort of discourses outside of like mainstream, modernist thought that have made artwork, but do it with a real distinct like singularity. And find that balance. I think it's actually one of the hardest things to do with artwork. So I feel that this sculpture to me is closer to what I want out of a kind of materials drawn from the site, working with this object, but presented in something that like holds an idea in a more simplified form, even though the things might be layered in terms of their material sources. Because at the end of the day, this thing is just kind of a staff. Does that sort of get to some of what you were wanting to know about? I mean, I have a lot that I could say. Materials are actually part of the reason why I really like working with objects, because it's just like a constant game of exploration, and you just never get bored. There's so many different things and to explore and open up the potential of, or see things in a different way, or use them in a different way than other people have before. It's also sort of infuriating because I feel like I'm reinventing the wheel all the time, but I guess it keeps me on my toes.
Time is running out, but is there any more questions, late comments before we are closing up here? If not, then thank you very much, Matt.
Thank you for the conversation, Rasmus. Thank you all for being an audience. It's been a pleasure to talk about this work. To let the cat out of the bag a little bit, this is actually the first time that I've fully lectured on just making objects. Most of the time when I've lectured in the past, it's been based on performance or more interdisciplinary based practice. And I thought to myself, I was like, I'm gonna stay concentrated on objects this time and see how that goes. Turns out I have kind of a lot to say about it. So, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.